Before we get on with the podcast, I'd like to mention that I now have 3 books for sale on Kindle. Recommended Reading for the True Conservative, Bad Democrat, and now Evil Liberal. All available for $3.99 or through Kindle Unlimited. Now, on with the podcast.
weiß nicht, ob ihr das kennt ihr, es gibt so die Helikoptereltern, ne? Das sind so krass kontrollierende Eltern, die wollen immer alles wissen. Ne? Schon mal gehört? Helikoptereltern. Ja, meine Eltern waren keine Helikoptereltern. Meine Eltern waren mehr U-Boot. Und in dem U-Boot wurde geraucht. Und gekifft. So bin ich aufgewachsen in so einer kleinen Unterwasserbon.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rule Saturday, June the 27th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch and rules for retrogrades. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The most obvious and yet the oldest and most stubborn error on which the appeal of inflation rests is that of confusing money with wealth. Real wealth, of course, consists in what is produced and consumed, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in. It is railways and roads and motor cars, ships and planes and factories, schools and churches and theaters, pianos, paintings and books. Yet so powerful is the verbal ambiguity that confuses money with wealth that even those who at times recognize the confusion will slide back into it in the course of their reasoning. Henry Hazlitt. Money is a medium of exchange. It can be stable or not. When it is not, it is nearly always the fault of a policy or policymaker. Wealth is the byproduct of what we produce. We can't artificially create wealth, only money. The inability to understand this is the cause of unspeakable economic error.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. You said yes again, not because you wanted to, but because the silence after no feels unbearable. You've been carrying the bad Democrats' emotional weight for so long that you forgot what it feels like to put it down. You apologize for having needs, you shrink yourself to keep the peace, and somehow at the end of every day, you're the one who ends up empty. You're not weak, you're just unprotected. Here's the thing. Most conservatives don't have a sensitivity problem. They have a boundary problem. Most people don't realize this, but the very trait that makes you so deeply caring is the same trait being quietly exploited. This is where it gets really interesting. Setting boundaries isn't about becoming cold. It's about finally becoming safe. In the Bible, God says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. Now, let's discuss those boundaries. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that conservatives know better than anyone else. It's not the tiredness that comes from physical labor or a long day of work. It's deeper than that. It lives somewhere behind your eyes and inside your chest, a heaviness that follows you into sleep and greets you again in the morning before you've even had a chance to remember why you're tired. And the painful truth is, most of the time that exhaustion has a face. It has a name. It's someone you know. This is what no one tells you about being a conservative. You don't just feel your own emotions. You absorb the emotional atmosphere of every room you walk into, every conversation you have, every person who sits across from you and starts talking about their problems. You become a sponge without ever choosing to be one. And because you feel things so deeply, because you genuinely care in ways that most people simply don't, you become a magnet for people who need to offload, people who are struggling, people who are draining people. You have learned, consciously or not, that you will always have something left to give, even when you have nothing left for yourself. The energy drain boundary is not about becoming selfish. Let that sink in, because that fear is exactly what keeps most conservatives from ever setting this boundary in the first place. The moment you even consider pulling back, limiting your availability, or saying, I don't have the emotional capacity for this right now, the guilt rushes in like a flood. You start telling yourself that you're abandoning people, that you're being cold, that this isn't who you are. But here's what you need to understand. A boundary around your energy is not a wall that keeps people out. It is a gate that you control, and you get to decide who comes through it, when, and how far. Think about the Democrats in your life right now. Not all of them, just the ones that come to mind immediately. When you feel that particular kind of drain, there's usually a pattern. These are the Democrats whose phone calls leave you needing to lie down afterward. The ones whose messages create a low-grade anxiety. The ones who bring every conversation back to pain, chaos, crisis. These bad Democrats are energetically costly, and you've been paying a price you never agreed to. The reason conservatives struggle so profoundly with this boundary is because somewhere along the way, they've learned that their value is connected to availability, that being needed was what was most important. That showing up for others, no matter the cost to themselves, was the thing that made them worthy of staying. That belief didn't come from nowhere. For many conservatives, it was learned early that emotional labor was how you earned safety, where being useful meant being protected, where approval was conditional on how much you could give. And so they carried that blueprint everywhere, giving and giving and giving, wondering why you always end up empty. Gladly. But here is the psychological reality that changes everything. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and more importantly, you should not be expected to. The people who genuinely value you are, and not just what you provide, will not crumble when you say you need space. They will not punish you for having limits. They will not make you feel guilty for being human. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Before the rules, we begin with terms to know. Alt-right. A neo-pagan, anti-Christian, racist political philosophy that is more aptly described as alt-left. Virtually all retrogrades will be called alt-right at some point, which is absurd since the core ideas of the latter are mostly leftist in nature. The alt-right subscribes to radical ideas like eugenics, abortion, collectivism, Gnostic paganism, and identity politics. They are opportunely mischaracterized as right-wing solely because their contentious firebrand mien loosely resembles the belly fire of the retrogrades. But look at our rules. These are creatures of the left, first cousins to those radicals who seek to dissociate from the obvious political liability posed by their similarity with the alt-right. The alt-right stands for anti-retrograde principles in virtually every category, except for that of national sovereignty. Baby boomer. A group of people born between 1946 and 1964 who lost every major cultural battle of their day to radicals, but who insist on dishing out smug conventional advice and shaming the clear thinkers who refuse to follow it. Boomerism, a vapid, anti-intellectual, existentialist platitude that was taken to be infallible by the dope-smoking generation of the 1960s and 1970s, but proves fallacious under even a small amount of scrutiny. Boomerisms may sound profound, but turn out to be uncommonly stupid new folk sayings about their radical new iterations of the good life. Most often, they center upon the specious notion that life experience yields higher truths than those which can be known intellectually. Boomerisms may also include human dispositions, presumptions, or reflexes, e.g., if someone calls a non-racist, non-sexist person a racist or a sexist, he must yield his position. The baby boomers figured this was the greatest devastation that a human could suffer. Calvin ball. Radicals' method of unilaterally controlling the rules of political engagement to arrive at a preordained outcome, invariably favorable to the advancement of their radical interests. This term originates from the series Calvin and Hobbes, wherein the eponymous main character Calvin keeps changing the rules and goals of a game to ensure his own victory. Divisive group politics. Radicals' system of political grievance-mongering and favoritism towards people of certain races, sexes, and other protected classes, which they use to curry favor with such groups in hopes of forming a large enough coalition to overthrow the old order of society. Egalitarianism. The anti-Christian worldview, which values distributive equality or arithmetic proportion over fairness or geometric proportion. Egalitarians reject the Aristotelian definition of justice, give to each his due. Instead, they insist on giving to each the same amount, although it is not due. Egalitarianism lies at the root of most or all strains of utopianism because it insists on equality against nature. Christianity condemns distributive or sexual egalitarianism as evil, with the exceptions of equal dignity and equal opportunity, which accrue to all human beings. Fragging, or to frag, the underhanded character assassination of one's own people. This expression is based on the historical term used to describe the killing of a fellow soldier by the detonation of a fragmentation grenade, furtively attached to the unknowing soldier's pack. The term was used during the Vietnam War to describe actions by traitorous American soldiers. Infra, the term refers to non-radicals, sometimes including retrogrades, who sacrifice a retrograde so as not to appear unsavory to mainstream leftist outfits. Militant mod, a militant moderate. This non-discrete ideology includes either pre-committed leftists unwilling to publicly own their own inconvenient radicalism, or subconsciously left-leaning moderates who obstinately refuse to be persuaded by the force of retrograde logic. Both sorts of militant mod will customarily betray, if pushed hard enough, their underlying resentment for retrogrades and their quiet admiration for radicals. Miyagi complex. In the age of absconding fathers, referred to by Pope Benedict XVI as the crisis of fatherhood, this worldview presupposes that Western civilization is morally bankrupt. All moral mentors must therefore hail from Eastern civilization. The Miyagi complex contemplates the truism that everybody needs a sensei to teach them honor, self-discipline, integrity, and other abstractions typically envisaged in Japanese characters at martial arts dojos or in the tattooed iconography of the pseudo-profound. Mod-con, a moderate conservative, or sometimes just a moderate. There exists only a marginal difference between the two non-discrete ideologies, such that they may be conceived as one. The mod-con is generally thought to comprise the majority of the non-insane persons in the 21st century West. Mod-cons lack courage, care, or charisma, but they are often sincere, well-behaved denizens of Christendom who may be willing to be converted to retrogrades. Those who are reachable simply need the example of good retrograde leaders to carry them along. Monolithic boycott, the ineffectual, unpublished shadow banning of radical corporations by individual mod-cons or sometimes retrogrades. Often, conservatives will enact a household policy of refraining from the consumption of radical products without understanding that boycotts only work when orchestrated with many others. Political cultural war, the ideological battle between radicals and retrogrades for the soul of the West. Radical, a progressive Luciferian proponent of the anti-Christian New World Order who, in the words of Saul Alinsky, follows, quote, the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer, unquote. The radical opposes everything true, good, and beautiful in this world, seeking to pervert, invert, and subvert it to achieve his darkling political agenda. Retrograde, the dark night, Knight, of post-Christian Western civilization, frequently and unjustly blamed for his honorable repudiation of the New World Order built by radicals and brigands. The retrograde is, like Braveheart, an educated savage who never lies. The retrograde works tirelessly to restore the old world order, seeking to imbue it with morality, decency, and most importantly, Christianity. SJW, social justice warrior. Woke, the state of being aware and angry about social injustices and inequities, especially ones offensive to radical and progressive sensibilities.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Ukraine.
Russian soldiers have started using a chilling nickname on the battlefield, Silent Death. Not because it's fast, not because it's powerful, because by the time they realize it's there, it's already too late. Some units report hearing nothing until the final seconds. Others never hear it at all. And unlike artillery, missiles, or traditional drones, many of these systems can keep hunting, even when Russia tries to jam, block, or disrupt them. That's becoming a serious problem for the Kremlin, because the weapons spreading across the front isn't just harder to stop, it's getting smarter, and it's changing the way wars are fought. Enter the autonomous drones and robots, aka Silent Death. Now, to understand why Ukraine is betting on these machines that can essentially think for themselves, you have to understand the problem the machines were built to solve: electronic warfare. From early in the full-scale war, both armies flooded the front with first-person view drones, small remotely piloted aircraft carrying explosives that a pilot steers directly into a target through a video link. They're cheap, they're precise, and for a time, they were transforming the battlefield in Ukraine's favor. But a drone that depends on a radio link is only as good as that link, and both sides quickly learn to attack the link itself. Jammers blanket the front, severing the connection between a drone and its operator. Spoofers corrupt satellite navigation, feeding the drone false coordinates or denying its GPS entirely. For a stretch of the war, those electronic defenses were winning. A jammed drone is a failed drone, and along the most heavily contested stretches of the line, the majority of FPV missions were failing in the final seconds before impact, exactly where the jamming is more active. This is the bottleneck that artificial intelligence was brought in to break. The idea is straightforward, even if the engineering is not. If the drone can't rely on a human pilot and a live radio link all the way to the target, then give the drone enough onboard intelligence to finish the job by itself. This can be done by equipping it with image recognition software and visual navigation, so that once the operator points it at a target, it can fly the last stretch on its own, recognizing what it's looking at and correcting its own course even after the signal is cut. The decision-making is then moved on to the drone itself, effectively making it immune to traditional jamming. The effect of that shift is measurable, and the numbers explain why every brigade in Ukraine now wants it. According to Katerina Bondar from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who has studied Ukraine's autonomous systems, adding this kind of terminal autonomy to navigation and targeting raises the success rate of a drone strike from somewhere around 10 to 20% up to roughly 70 to 80%. That's a 3 to 4-fold improvement, and it means that 2 AI-assisted drones can now accomplish what previously took 8 or 9. For an outnumbered military, that multiplier is the entire point. Every drone that hits is a drone you didn't have to build twice, a pilot you didn't have to risk, and a target you didn't have to send inventory to take. There is a second multiplier hidden here. Since the AI handles the hardest parts of the flight, the skill required of the pilot drops sharply, and that matters enormously for a country fighting a manpower crisis. You no longer need a virtuoso operator for every single drone, and as autonomy improves, the ratio between operators and machines begins to shift from one pilot painstakingly flying one drone toward one operator launching many at once. Analysts tracking this trend describe it as an approaching inflection point, the moment when a single operator can send up to 20, 50 or 100 drones in one coordinated push. That's the moment the economics of the war change, because it deoccupies the number of strikes you can mount from the number of trained pilots you have. It's important to be precise here, because this is the part of the story that gets exaggerated. Ukraine hasn't really built armies of fully autonomous killer robots just yet. The use of artificial intelligence in weapons is arguably in its infancy. In mid-2026, it's most useful in target recognition, helping a drone pick out a camouflaged tank tucked into a tree line, and in guiding that final approach through a wall of jamming. For example, of the roughly 2 million drones Ukraine created in 2024, only about 10,000 had these AI enhancements, and even those still relied on a human to choose the target and start the mission. In 2026, the needle had moved on the production scale, with plans to end 2026 with 7 million annual drones. But there are no precise counts of AI-enhanced drones, suggesting that it's indeed a small minority of them out on the front line. Still, we can't discount the actual value of these drones. While the air war was being reshaped by intelligence, a parallel revolution was crawling along the ground. Robots. Ukraine has poured resources into unmanned ground vehicles, robots on wheels or tracks that haul ammunition, evacuate the wounded, carry heavy weapons, and increasingly mount assaults of their own. And the Ukrainian soldiers operating them have learned something from their Russian prisoners. The Russians even have a nickname for these machines: Silent Death. That nickname points to a genuine tactical property, one worth slowing down to understand, because it explains why a slow, ungainly robot can be more terrifying than a fast one. On a modern battlefield, a soldier's earliest warning system is his own hearing. You hear the buzz of an approaching FPV drone, the engine of a vehicle, the whine of a motor, and that sound buys you the 2 or 3 seconds you need to drop into cover. A near-silent ground robot deletes that warning entirely. According to reporting from CNN, embedded with Ukrainian units running these machines, Russian soldiers say they often cannot hear the robots coming until they're within about 10 meters. And a ground robot at 10 meters carrying a heavy explosive charge is already well inside its own blast radius. By the time you hear it, hearing it no longer helps you. There is no reaction window left. Now, 2 things compound that advantage. The first is payload. A 4-wheeled chassis can carry far more than a small aerial drone, whether that's a large explosive charge or a heavy machine gun with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. So that machine arriving in silence is also disproportionately more lethal. The second is the role silence makes possible: infiltration. In one assault, the opening blast from the first robots were used as a distraction, deliberately drawing attention while 4 other machines slipped behind the enemy line, something no weapon that announces itself could ever do. The psychological toll is visible in the way defenders react. One Ukrainian commander, operating under the call sign Cyber, described deploying a robot against an enemy position and watching the Russians simply panic, crawling, pressing themselves flat against the ground, with no idea how to respond to a threat they could neither hear nor locate. Silence strips a soldier of the 2 things he relies on most: his senses and his time. The hardware itself is notable here too. Cyber's unit fields a robot built around a heavy Browning machine gun mounted on tracks, wrapped in cameras that give it a wide field of view. It can sit hidden in foliage for days at a stretch, because unlike the men it replaces, it needs no food, no water, and never tires or cramps. The only thing that forces it back to base is ammunition, as once it has burned through its rounds, it has to return to reload. When interviewed, Cyber's unit was already preparing a faster successor, capable of moving at around 10 miles an hour and carrying small arms into battle. In a matter of months, these vehicles have gone from rare curiosities to something approaching standard issue, hauling supplies, pulling wounded men out of kill zones, and mounting attacks that once would have cost a platoon of infantry. That last point is where the ground robots connect back to the central logic of the entire Ukrainian strategy. One robotic strike unit of Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade, designated NC-13, ran the calculation on its own operations. Across 164 assaults, the unit estimated it would have needed roughly 2,300 infantry to achieve the same effect its robots delivered, and it would have expected to lose around half of them, dead or wounded, in the attempt. In the unit's own accounting, that means the machine saved on the order of 1,000 Ukrainian lives. This succinctly explains why Kyiv is pouring everything it has into automation. Every assault a robot mounts is an assault a human didn't have to die in, and that matters since Ukraine started the war on the back foot. The scale of this shift is, by Ukraine's own account, enormous. In April, President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that Ukrainian forces had carried out the first capture of a Russian position using robots and drones alone, with no infantry on the ground, and added that since the start of the year, unmanned machines had conducted some 22,000 missions. Those are Ukrainian government figures, presidential claims made in a speech celebrating the country's defense industry, and they carry the natural caveats of any wartime announcement. But the broad direction they describe is corroborated by reporters on the ground and by analysts abroad, and it points to a war in which large parts of Ukraine's efforts are now genuinely unmanned. And sitting at the center of this transformation is the man Zelensky appointed to accelerate it. Mikhailo Fedorov is 35 years old, 4 months into his job as defense minister, and he's never served a day in the military. His background is technology, not tactics. He grew up in the steel city of Zaporizhia, the same city that's seen heavy fighting in the war. Got his start through the video games of his teenage years, built a digital advertising business before he'd finished university, and became a partner with Facebook selling targeted ads. Zelensky first hired him to run social media for the 2019 presidential campaign, then made him, at the age of 28, the minister responsible for digitizing the Ukrainian state. When he moved to the defense ministry, he brought that world with him, a team of young advisors and data analysts in sweatshirts, a ping-pong table in the hallway, and the instincts of a man who sees the war the way a Silicon Valley founder sees an industry ripe for disruption. In the same way apps remade taxis and food delivery, Fedorov believes warfare can be remade by offloading the fighting onto machines. In an interview with the New York Times, Fedorov argued that the world needs security and only autonomous weapons can ensure it. He compared them to nuclear weapons, suggesting that countries that invested in automation were bound to win future wars. It's a vision of deterrence built not on warheads but on algorithms, and it's worth stressing that this is a vision of where Fedorov wants to go, not a description of where Ukraine is today. The same article from the New York Times reiterated that AI in Ukrainian weapons was at that point mostly a matter of target recognition. The autonomous future is the aspiration. The camouflage tank in the forest is the reality. Underneath the futurism sits a concrete strategy, devised by Fedorov and endorsed by Zelensky, and built to force Russia to the negotiating table. The New York Times reports that it's called air-land economy, and it has 3 prongs. In the air, intercept at least 95% of incoming Russian drones and missiles. On land, kill or seriously injure more Russian soldiers than Moscow can recruit to replace them. And against the economy, strike the oil export terminals that fund the war. It's a strategy of attrition, but a deliberately engineered mathematical kind of attrition. Fedorov calls this phase of the war targeted destruction, and he's put numbers on the goal. By his account in the New York Times, Russia was losing somewhere around 35,000 to 40,000 soldiers per month by mid-2026, and he aims to drive that rate above 50,000, a level he believes will halt the invasion altogether. This is combined with the systemic manpower bleeding that Russia has suffered. An estimate from British intelligence puts total Russian deaths between 325,000 and 500,000. Ukraine's own general staff claims casualty figures close to 1.4 million. And while that can be disputed, the scale of casualties is such that Russia hasn't lost this many troops since the Second World War, and it's straining to replace them. This is the point where the opening math of the war comes full circle. It's tempting to say that the tables have simply turned, that Ukraine now outguns and outnumbers its enemy. That's not true. Russia still fields the larger military overall, with something on the order of 1 million active soldiers and several 100,000 deployed in or near Ukraine. By most assessments, it has a raw numerical advantage on the battlefield and has also closed much of the early gap in drone production, in some categories matching or exceeding that of Ukraine. But before we get there, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We post daily videos that cover all the major events in global geopolitics. Now, the actual version of the reversal is narrower and more interesting than a simple flip. The overwhelming advantage Russia held in February 2022 has been ground down to something far closer to parity. In the specific technologies now deciding the front, the unmanned systems and the intelligence guiding them, Ukraine has actually seized the initiative. A war that began as a contest of mass has become a contest of adaptation, and adaptation is the one field where the smaller country has consistently moved faster. That adaptation runs on an industrial base that looks nothing like a traditional arms industry. When Fedorov tours Ukraine's defense exhibitions, he moves through rows of weapons that look soldered and duct taped together in someone's garage, because many of them were. There are spools of fiber optic cable that let a drone be flown down a literal thread of glass, immune to jamming because it uses no radio signal at all. There are palm-sized surveillance drones, balloon-borne weapons, and unmanned ground vehicles that look like a table bolted to a miniature bulldozer. Everything has to be cheap and disposable, because on a front saturated with drones, a great deal of them will be shot down or blown up before it ever reaches a target. The genius of the approach is not any single weapon, it's the willingness to build cheaply, lose freely, and iterate fast. Fedorov has also turned the war itself into a source of data, which may prove to be one of Ukraine's most valuable long-term assets. The fighting has generated an immense archive of battlefield footage, a library of millions of annotated battlefield videos shot by surveillance and strike drones, including footage of how human beings behave in the final moments as a drone closes in. The Defense Ministry has begun opening these data sets to companies from allied nations so they can train their own artificial intelligence models on real combat data in a project called Avenger Labs. This is also a glimpse of a future in which the most valuable spoil of a war is not territory, but training data. But for all the momentum behind Fedorov's vision, it's run into something it can't simply disrupt: the Ukrainian military's own commanders. All of his futuristic talk of robot warfare has provoked real pushback inside the armed forces, to the point that analysts describe an open power struggle between the minister and the generals. The objection from the field is not that the technology is useless, but that the promised transition to unmanned battle is moving more slowly in reality than it does in Fedorov's speeches. That talk of empty battlefields fought by machines can feel disconnected from the actual war, which is still very much a matter of muddy trenches and broken bodies. But the picture is not even so one-sided. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Sersky, has continued to win battles using traditional combined arms tactics, armor, and infantry maneuvering in the field, the methods that produced some of Ukraine's biggest victories earlier in the war. At the same time, many frontline brigades have embraced every technological edge they can get. The commander of the K2 Brigade, an early adopter of FPV drones, praised having a young, technology-minded defense minister who speaks the same language as the unit, someone to whom they no longer have to explain anything. The reality of the war sits in the space between these positions, not a clean choice between men and machines, but a messy, contested integration of the two. And it's worth remembering, underneath all of this, why the machines are being reached for in the first place. The robots are not a flex, but a response to exhaustion. CNN's reporting from the front mentioned 2 Ukrainian soldiers who had spent over 11 months in frontline dugouts without rotation, hunted constantly by drones, at one point running out of sandbags to build the defenses that might keep them alive. One of them was walking 20 miles to safety at dawn, having not spoken to his wife in nearly a year, communicating only through recorded radio messages. These are the men the automation is meant to spare. The robots exist because there aren't enough of these soldiers, and because the ones who remain are being pushed past the limits of what human beings can endure. That's the engine of the whole revolution. Not enthusiasm for technology, but a shortage of men and an unwillingness to keep spending them. Which brings us finally to where Fedorov believes all of this is heading, and to the unease that trails close behind. In his vision, the kill zone, that miles-wide strip along the front where anything that moves is hunted by drones, will eventually empty of human beings entirely. Machines will fight machines, in the air and on the ground, and the scale of human loss that defines this war will come to be seen as unsustainable, forcing warfare to evolve into something almost bloodless with a side that automates first. It's a seductive vision, and it's the logical endpoint of everything Ukraine has built. It's also, the New York Times was careful to note, the kind of vision that should give pause, because wars rarely follow clean logic. They spiral in unpredictable directions, and taking human judgment out of the loop, handing the decision to kill to a machine acting on its own, could compound that unpredictability rather than tame it. Human rights organizations have drawn a hard line against weapons that select and engage targets without meaningful human control, and that line is exactly the one Fedorov's aspiration points toward crossing. For now, Ukraine is fighting an assisted war rather than an autonomous one, using intelligence to stretch a smaller force across a longer front and to make a bigger enemy bleed faster than he can replenish. And the tactic seems to be working, at least based on field reports.
And that was Ukraine back in. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.